Now, of course, we want to know, don't we, who these guys are. And it's really tempting to read all the stuff you can read in various books and speculations, say, oh yeah, Meshech refers to this place, and Tubal, they used to use Tubal to refer to that place, and oh yeah, it's Russia, or it's here, it's Turkey, or it's there and everywhere, it's Ukraine or whatever. Well, that may be a valid way to look at it, I don't know, but there is no question that you cannot prove, in terms of historical geography, exactly where these places were. And a lot of it is guesswork. It really is. But I want you to notice that a number of those nations, such as Tyre, or Tarshish as it's called in chapter 38, Meshech, Tubal, have already been mentioned within Ezekiel, especially in chapters 27 and 32, and they've been predicted to have their end, or even their end has been lamented. And yet here we read about these same guys who Ezekiel has earlier said are going to be destroyed as coming against the land of Israel in the last days. So I think the message of that is there will be a revival. There will be a revival of those nations within the land promised to Abraham. And that is, of course, exactly what we've seen. Exactly what we've seen. And in fact, when you read in the opening part of the prophecy in chapter 38, verse 4, I will turn you back, many English Bibles say. The idea is, I think, I will restore your fortunes, which is how the same Hebrew phrase is often translated elsewhere in more modern English Bibles. The idea is there will be a revival. Gog and these nations, etc., that Ezekiel has previously said are destroyed, there will be a revival of these people. And that's just what you've seen. But for centuries, there were just Bedouins wandering around those desert areas of the Middle East. Even for millennia, you could say. But now, in the last few decades, there has arisen out of the sand, as it were, out of the deserts, thanks to oil, there has arisen out of those deserts an entity, the Islamic State, that is looking to destroy Israel. Now you can see why we're excited about this, that this kind of situation in geopolitics has not been seen, and yet it is now literally before our eyes fulfilling the requirements of these Bible prophecies. So then, Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tyre, or Tarshish, verse 13, they want to come in and join in as well. That's what I think the Hebrew text implies. When they say, have you come to take a spoil and take a prey, they're not so much saying, hey, what are you doing? Stop. They're saying, oh, you're going to take that? Well, we'll jump in as well. And if you look at my book, The Islamic State and Bible Prophecy, you'll see references to the Hebrew argument there about the text. Now then, all these people are the kings of the earth, the kings of the land, the leaders within the land promised to Abraham. Now, it could be that there are 10 separate sections, as it were, under the Islamic State. It could be that there are 10 leaders of the Islamic State. That's something to watch out for. But the point is, they are the kings of the earth. It's not talking about the whole planet. It's talking about the land promised to Abraham. I mean, it really has to mean that. I mean, when you read that all the kings of the earth came to Solomon to hear his wisdom and brought him presents, well, it doesn't mean that the king of, I don't know, New Zealand, or what is now known as Argentina or Canada or whatever, that the king of Canadian Indians came to Solomon. No. It's talking about the earth as in the land promised to Abraham. And that's really your choice with Eretz. Does it mean the whole planet? It can mean the whole planet. Or is it having its more localized, specific reference to the territory promised to Abraham? I think there's no question it must be referring to that in these prophecies. Now, when you look at the number of nations that are listed here in Ezekiel 38, you find that Gog is not a nation, he's a man, he's the leader, and if you include Sheba, Dedan and Tarshish, and if you take Rosh as referring to not a nation, but as I've said, the chief prince. Then you have 10 nations within the land promised to Abraham, plus Persia, Iran. Now, we looked elsewhere in other presentations in Daniel 2, the 10 toes of the image will stand on the land of Israel in the last days and dominate it, and those 10 toes morph, as it were, into the 10 horns on the beast in Daniel 7, and of course Revelation develops further the idea of a beast with 10 horns. So, and you've got 10 nations again in Psalm 83, which is another prediction of the latter day invasion of Israel. And again, it's 10 entities around Israel from within the territory of the Eretz, the land promised to Abraham from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt. Now that again is coming into focus and into sort of credible possibility of fulfillment, because instead of it being barren deserts out there in the Middle East, there's now powerful nations and weaponry, etc., out there, united by a common hatred of Jewish people and a desire to take Jerusalem to be their capital, or their beloved holy city. So then the picture you get here in Ezekiel 38 is of 10 nations under the leadership of one man, Gog, 10 nations within the territory of the land promised to Abraham, plus Persia, Iran. Now, Iran is not in the land promised to Abraham, but again, you can imagine that coming true, can't you? If that entity, let's say, that Islamic entity, beast, state, whatever you want to call it, if that moves against Israel, can you imagine Iran with its fanatical hatred of Israel? Can you imagine them just standing there not doing anything? They're going to jump in as well. I would suggest that Turkey and Egypt are strangely not mentioned here in doing this, and I would expect both of those nations to shift a bit more towards the West. Turkey is already on path to joining the European Union. And it's also worth noting that Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish, or Tyre, are mentioned separately as three separate people, as three separate groups that come in maybe a little bit later. Is there something going on there when you read in Daniel 7 about 3 horns? That 3 of the horns out of the 10 are mentioned somehow separately. I'll just leave you to think about that. Now, the other thing, when you read of these 10 nations within Ezekiel 38, you find that every single one of them, there's 10 plus Persia, I'm talking about the 10 of them that are within the land promised to Abraham, the kings of the earth, the kings of the land. Every one of those 10 occurs in Genesis chapter 10, where you have the table of nations, all of them, Meshech, Tubal, Cush, which is the AV in Ezekiel 38 talks about Ethiopia, Put, the AV talks about Libya, but it's all the same word. Gomer, Beth-togarmah, Dedan, Tarshish, Sheba, all these guys are mentioned in Genesis 10 in the Table of Nations. So what's the Table of Nations? Well, it's after the flood, when Shem, Ham, and Japheth come out of the ark and start having kids, and their kids have kids, and so forth. Genesis 10 lists their genealogies, lists their descendants, and all up there's 70 nations mentioned. Those 70 nations are not the nations of the whole planet. They are the nations that inhabited the land promised to Abraham after the earth or the land was flooded. And I obviously am arguing there for a local flood. If you're going to argue for a global flood, well, you've certainly got some pretty big logistical problems getting all the animals inside an ark. And you've got problems with kangaroos getting from Mount Ararat to Australia, and marsupials only being out in Australia, and like what happened, did not a single marsupial sort of stay in a similar climate on its way from Ararat out to Australia. Oh, there's a whole mass of problems which are not, you don't need to sort of beat your head up about those issues if you accept the earth, meaning the land, as in the territory promised to Abraham. That was flooded. And after that, Shem, Ham, and Japheth came out of the ark, had their kids, their descendants, and they then dwelt in that land. Because you see, the whole intention of the book of Genesis and the Torah was that Moses was explaining to Israel in the wilderness God's take on history and geography. Because there they were, come out of Egypt, listening to all sorts of gossip and myth, historical myth that they were hearing from the peoples they passed through. And God, through Moses, was giving them in Genesis his explanation of how Israel came to be located where they were, and giving them their understanding, self-understanding, within the context of other peoples and nations. So then, the conflicts that are described between Shem, Ham, and Japheth, especially with Ham and his descendant Canaan being somehow subservient to Shem. This is not talking about black people, it's not talking about white Europeans. This is all wishful thinking of 19th century Western European so-called theologians who just opportunistically justified what they were doing in Africa, etc., but by saying, oh yeah, you know what, this is what the Bible says, this is what Genesis 10 says. This is nonsense. This is about as crazy as looking at Tubal and saying, oh, that sounds like a little place called Tobolsk right out in Siberia. No, this is not how to interpret the Bible. Clearly, the conflict that is envisaged between Canaan, or where does Canaan live? In the land of Canaan, believe it or not, which is not Africa, it's not England, it's not America, it is there in the land promised to Abraham. The conflict between Canaan and Shem, from whence the Israelites came, yes, that makes sense. So then, the names of those people in Ezekiel 38 are straight out of Genesis 10, which is an explanation of the nations within the land promised to Abraham. So when, for example, you read that Togarmah, in verse 6 of Ezekiel 38, came from the north border, that's from the northern border of the land promised to Abraham. As I say, if you either take Eretz, the land, or the earth, as talking about the whole planet, or you take it as the land promised to Abraham. If it's the whole planet, then Togarmah, from the uttermost parts of the north, from the north border, well, that would be like the Arctic Circle, presumably, if that's how you want to look at it. It's not Moscow, not Tobolsk, or whatever, it's Arctic Circle. And no, the whole idea of a border from the north border of the earth, well, you know, a sphere doesn't have borders, if you see what I'm saying. A territory that is defined and we know where the boundary lines are, yes, that makes sense. And what is that territory? It's the Eretz, the land promised to Abraham. Now, there are 70 nations listed in Genesis 10, these families of the earth. And it's interesting that Gog and Magog, that phrase, in Hebrew, its numerical value is 70. In Revelation 20 verse 8, you have the same idea, paralleling Gog and Magog with all the nations of the land. Revelation 20 verse 8, to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters or borders of the land, Gog and Magog. So Gog and Magog are, as it were, the parallel with all these nations, because Gog is going to lead the nations from the four corners of the earth, the land promised to Abraham. And as I say, a sphere, if you're going to insist that it doesn't mean the land promised to Abraham, but it means the whole planet, well then, since when has the planet got quarters or borders, or, corners? It doesn't have. Now, this invasion comes up, verse 12, against the navel of the land, the Hebrew says, the bit that sticks out, the high place. Now I suggest that this is Jerusalem. The Greeks talked about their sanctuaries as the navel of their land. So the idea is a religious sanctuary. And both in Judaism, Hebrew thought, as well as biblically, the idea is that you go up to Jerusalem. And then when you leave Jerusalem and go somewhere else, you go down. You go down from Jerusalem to, for example, to Caesarea or whatever. And there's quite some emphasis in Ezekiel 38, verses 9, 11, 16, and in chapter 39, verse 2, that Gog comes up. He ascends like a cloud. A cloud doesn't, in that sense, ascend. The language of going up, I suggest, is because it's to Jerusalem. And of course, we started by looking at how Gog is the latter-day Assyrian. And all those Isaiah passages that I quoted to you, showing how Gog the Assyrian that Gog in Ezekiel is the Assyrian of Isaiah, all those Isaiah passages are specifically talking about Assyria coming up against Jerusalem. And you have that confirmed really in Revelation 20, when again you read about Gog and Magog coming up against the city of God, against Jerusalem, the holy city. So I think you can expect there to be a far greater focus specifically on Jerusalem from the Islamic State and from the nations within the land promised to Abraham. These guys that are getting together under one charismatic leader, the focus is going to shift away, finally, from infighting, etc., and even from fighting the West, towards not only Israel, but specifically Jerusalem. And we know that this has been the great difficult point in all Israeli-Arab negotiations, the status of Jerusalem.